Sometimes the most dangerous prisons are the ones we build around our own hearts. The gas lamps of Whitmore Manor had been dark for over 2 centuries, but on this bitter November night in 1887, something stirred in the shadows of its crumbling halls. Mira Blackwood pressed her thin frame against the manor's iron gates, her threadbare coat no match for London's merciless fog. She had learned to survive on scraps and silence, but tonight the streets offered neither shelter nor safety. What she didn't know was that her desperate choice to break into the abandoned estate would awaken more than just memories. Hidden beneath years of dust and decay, an ancient hellhound named Fenris had been waiting, bound by blood magic to protect his vampire master's tomb. When Mira's trembling voice spoke a single word in a language she barely understood, everything changed. The beast that should have torn her apart instead bowed his massive head, and from the depths of the manor came footsteps that hadn't echoed in 200 years. Vampire King Lucian Ashworth was about to discover that the homeless girl who freed him carried a bloodline he thought extinct, and a power that could either redeem his cursed existence or damn them all. But what happens when a girl who has nothing left to lose meets a king who has forgotten how to live? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The iron gate shrieked against its rusted hinges as Mira forced her way through the gap, the sound echoing across the abandoned courtyard like a death knell. Her fingers, already numb from the November cold, left bloody smears on the metal bars. 3 years of living rough had taught her to squeeze through impossibly tight spaces, but desperation made her careless tonight. Behind her, the East End's narrow alleys crawled with dangers worse than hunger. The Ripper's blade had claimed another girl just 2 streets over, Mary Kelly, barely older than Mira herself. The constables were asking questions, and questions led to answers she couldn't afford to give. Not about the shadows that seemed to whisper her name, or the strange words that sometimes spilled from her lips in moments of terror, words like the ones that had gotten her mother killed. Mira stumbled across the overgrown courtyard, dead leaves crunching beneath her worn boots. Whitmore Manor loomed before her, its Gothic towers piercing the fog like accusing fingers. Locals whispered that the place was cursed, that unholy things dwelt within its walls. But local superstitions meant little to a girl who hadn't eaten in 2 days. The manor's grand entrance stood barred and chained, but Mira had spotted a broken window on the ground floor during her earlier reconnaissance. She'd learned to case potential shelters before committing. Empty houses sometimes harbored squatters more dangerous than the streets. Glass crunched beneath her as she climbed through the shattered window frame, careful not to slice herself on the jagged edges. She'd seen too many street children die from infected cuts to be reckless now. The darkness inside felt different somehow, thicker, more alive than ordinary shadow. It pressed against her skin like silk, and for a moment she could swear she heard it breathing. "Don't be daft," she told herself. But her voice seemed unnaturally loud in the suffocating quiet. The room she'd entered must have been a parlor once. Dust-covered furniture stood like tomb markers beneath canvas shrouds, and portraits lined the walls, their subjects' eyes seeming to track her movement through the gloom. Mira pulled a stub of candle from her coat pocket, stolen from St. Bartholomew's collection box, and struck one of her precious matches. The flame sputtered to life, casting dancing shadows that made the portraits seem to writhe. She cupped the light protectively as she explored, searching for a room with a fireplace where she might risk a small fire. The cold was seeping through her bones, and she'd learned that freezing to death was a slower, more painful end than most. Each step deeper into the manor made her skin crawl. The shadows here felt wrong, as if they were watching her with ancient, hungry eyes. More than once, she caught herself turning to look over her shoulder, certain something had moved in her peripheral vision. But there was never anything there, just more darkness, more dust, more decay. The dining room held a massive table that could have seated 20, its surface buried under years of grime. A grandfather clock stood silent in the corner, its hands frozen at midnight. Even the mice seemed to have abandoned this place, leaving only the whisper of wind through broken shutters to break the oppressive silence. It was in the library that she found the first sign of the manor's true nature. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their leather spines cracked and faded. But these weren't ordinary volumes. Even in the dim candlelight, she could see that many bore symbols instead of letters, twisting serpentine marks that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. Her mother had owned books like these once, hidden beneath loose floorboards and read only by moonlight. The memory hit her like a physical blow. Mother's voice, urgent and afraid. Never let them hear you speak the old words, Mira. Promise me you'll stay silent. But staying silent hadn't saved her mother from the men who'd come in the night. It hadn't stopped them from dragging her into the street while young Mira cowered in the closet, her hand clamped over her mouth to stifle the shadow words that wanted to pour out like a dam bursting. She'd broken that promise twice since then. Once when Tommy Fletcher had cornered her in an alley with his knife and his leering grin. Once when the workhouse keeper had tried to drag her back after her first escape attempt. Both times the words had spilled out unbidden, and both times the shadows had answered. Both times she'd run before anyone could process what they'd witnessed. Now, surrounded by books that reeked of the same forbidden knowledge, Mira felt the familiar stirring in her chest, that dangerous warmth that preceded the shadow speech. The candle flame flickered, and for just a moment, the library's shadows seemed to reach toward her like grasping fingers. She backed toward the door, heart hammering. She needed to find a safe room, somewhere without books or symbols or anything that might wake whatever darkness slumbered in this accursed place. But as she turned to flee, a sound stopped her cold, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. The growl faded into silence, leaving Mira's heart thundering against her ribs. She pressed herself against the library doorframe, every muscle coiled to run. Seconds stretched like hours as she waited for some monstrous thing to emerge from the shadows, but nothing came. Only the wind through broken shutters, only the settling of old wood. Just the house, she told herself, though her mother's voice echoed in her memory. Old places remember, little shadow. They hold on to what was done in darkness. Mira forced her feet to move, retreating from the accursed library toward the servants' quarters she'd glimpsed near the kitchen. There, in a cramped room that had once housed a scullery maid, she found what she needed: a small grate, 4 walls free of occult symbols, and a narrow window she could escape through if necessary. She allowed herself the luxury of a tiny fire, feeding it scraps of broken furniture and debris. As warmth crept back into her fingers, muscle memory took over. From her coat's inner pockets came the tools of survival: a bent spoon for eating whatever scraps she could find, a small knife with a chipped blade for protection, needle and thread for mending her clothes. Her most precious possessions: a dented locket containing her mother's portrait, and 3 copper pennies she kept sewn into the lining itself. This was her world now, had been for 3 years, ever since the workhouse. Every dawn brought the same desperate calculations: where to find food, where to sleep safely, how to avoid the constables, the predators, the well-meaning church ladies who wanted to save her soul. They never understood that salvation was a luxury for those who hadn't been marked by darkness. The fire crackled, and Mira allowed herself to remember better times. Before the men came for Mother, they'd had a small room above Mrs. Hartwell's bakery. Mother would braid her hair each morning while humming old songs that Mira now knew had been in the shadow tongue, though she hadn't understood then. There had been warmth, safety, the smell of fresh bread drifting up through the floorboards. Mother had worked as a seamstress, her fingers quick and clever with needle and thread. In the evenings she would teach Mira letters and numbers by candlelight, making her promise to practice even when it was difficult. "Education is freedom, little shadow," she'd say, using her pet name for Mira. "Knowledge is the one thing they can never take from you." But they had taken it, hadn't they? Along with Mother, along with safety, along with any hope of a normal life. The workhouse had stolen what remained: 2 years of gruel and beatings and nights spent listening to children cry themselves to sleep, until the night overseer Grimsby had cornered her in the laundry room, with his sweaty hands and his whiskey breath. and the shadow words had torn from her throat like living things. She'd run that very night, trading the workhouse's cruelty for the street's honest dangers. Now her days followed a brutal rhythm. Dawn meant moving before the constables began their rounds, finding a public fountain to wash her face and hands. The market vendors sometimes threw away bread that was only slightly stale, and if she timed it right, she could pilfer an apple or carrot when they weren't looking. The docks offered occasional work, a penny for helping unload cargo or mending a sailor's torn shirt. But it was never enough. Never safe. The other street children formed loose alliances, but Mira couldn't risk getting too close. What if the shadow words spilled out in her sleep? What if someone saw the way darkness seemed to gather around her when she was afraid or angry? Tommy Fletcher had learned her secret the hard way. She could still see his face when the shadows had wrapped around his throat like living rope, cutting off his air until he dropped his knife and stumbled backward, terror replacing the cruel hunger in his eyes. She'd whispered words she didn't remember learning, and the darkness had obeyed. Just like it had obeyed when the workhouse keeper grabbed her arm, when his fingers had left bruises on her wrist. The shadows had risen from every corner of the room, and his grip had loosened as if something invisible had struck him down. Both times, she'd run before anyone could make sense of what they'd witnessed. Both times, she'd added to the growing weight of isolation that pressed down on her shoulders like a stone. The fire was dying now, and Mira fed it another piece of broken chair leg. Outside the window, fog pressed against the glass like grasping fingers. Tomorrow she would return to the streets, to the endless search for food and shelter and safety that could never truly be found. But tonight, for just a few hours, she had walls around her and warmth on her face. It would have to be enough. It was always just barely enough. The warmth from the dying embers was pulling Mira toward the edge of sleep when she heard it again. That low, resonant growl that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the manor itself. This time, she couldn't dismiss it as settling timber or wind through broken shutters. This time, it was closer, much closer. Her eyes snapped open, and she realized with growing horror that the shadows in the corners of the small room had deepened, stretching toward her like dark fingers. The temperature had plummeted, her breath now visible in small puffs despite the fire's lingering heat. The very air felt charged, electric, as if a terrible storm was building inside the walls themselves. Mira scrambled to her feet, clutching her small knife. The blade trembled in her grip, more from the sudden cold than fear, though terror was rapidly climbing her throat. She'd made a terrible mistake coming here. The locals' whispered warnings hadn't been mere superstition. Something truly unholy dwelt within Whitmore Manor's walls. A sound like massive chains scraping against stone echoed through the house, followed by footsteps. Not human footsteps. These were too heavy, too deliberate, accompanied by the click of what sounded like claws against the manor's wooden floors. Each step sent vibrations through the building that she could feel in her bones. Run. Every survival instinct screamed the command. She should bolt for the narrow window, squeeze through, and take her chances with the November night. But as she moved toward her escape route, the footsteps stopped directly outside her door. The handle turned slowly, and Mira's blood turned to ice. She hadn't locked it, there had been no key, and she'd foolishly assumed the manor was as abandoned as it appeared. Now, as the door creaked open on protesting hinges, she realized how catastrophically wrong she'd been. What stepped into the room defied every nightmare she'd ever experienced. The creature stood nearly 7 feet tall, its massive frame filling the doorway. Thick black fur covered rippling muscles, and its eyes, God help her, its eyes, burned like twin coals in the darkness. This was no ordinary beast, but something born from shadow and flame, something that should not exist in the mortal world. A hellhound. The word surfaced from some buried corner of her memory, along with her mother's terrified whispers about the guardians that protected the old bloodlines. They are bound by magic older than Christianity, little shadow, bound to serve until death claims them or their master releases them. The creature's massive head swung toward her, nostrils flaring as it caught her scent. Its lips pulled back to reveal fangs longer than her fingers. white as bone and sharp as razors. A low rumble built in its chest, and she could feel the sound reverberating through her body like a death knell. Mira pressed herself against the wall, her knife utterly useless against such a monster. The hellhound's burning gaze fixed on her, and she saw intelligence there, ancient, terrible intelligence that recognized her for what she was. Not just a homeless girl seeking shelter, but something else, something that didn't belong here. The beast took a step forward, and then another, its massive paws silent despite its size. She could smell sulfur and old smoke, could feel heat radiating from its form like a forge. In moments, those terrible fangs would tear out her throat, and her 3-year struggle for survival would end in this forgotten room where no one would ever find her remains. But as the creature gathered itself to spring, something stirred within Mira's chest. The familiar warmth that preceded the shadow speech began to build, and words she'd never learned rose to her lips. Not English words, not any human language, but something far older, something that resonated with the same darkness that had birthed this terrible guardian. The hellhound's eyes widened as if it recognized the stirring power within her. Its growl shifted, becoming less predatory and more uncertain, confused, as if it scented something impossible, something that challenged everything it knew about the world. Mira felt the choice crystallize before her with perfect clarity. She could remain silent, die quietly as she'd lived, taking her secrets to an unmarked grave. Or she could speak the words that were burning her throat, release the power that had killed her mother, and marked her as an abomination. She could run toward almost certain death, or step forward into something far more terrifying than any beast, into her true nature. The hellhound's muscles bunched for its killing leap. Time slowed to honey-thick seconds. The shadow words pressed against her lips like living things demanding release. And in that crystalline moment between heartbeats, between breath and death, between her old life and whatever waited beyond, Mira Blackwood made her choice. But even as the words burned against her lips like molten silver, Mira hesitated. The hellhound hung suspended in that moment, before its killing leap, muscles coiled, burning eyes fixed on her face. She could feel the shadow speech building in her chest, like a dam about to burst, ancient syllables clawing at her throat, demanding release. But terror held her frozen, not of the beast before her, but of what would happen the instant those words left her lips. Mother's screams echoing through the night, the sound of boots on stairs, the smell of smoke and blood. Her hand trembled against the wall, and the small knife clattered to the floor. What was she thinking? 3 years of careful silence. 3 years of swallowing the shadow words, no matter how desperately they wanted to escape. And now she was ready to throw it all away for what? A few more moments of life? Because that's all it would be. The hellhound might pause, might even retreat if the old magic still held power. But then what? Others would come. They always came when the shadow speech was used. The men who had taken her mother had followed the resonance of forbidden words like bloodhounds on a scent trail. Promise me you'll stay silent, little shadow. Promise me. The creature's eyes narrowed, its great head tilting as if it could sense her internal struggle. The rumble in its chest deepened, and she realized with sick certainty that her hesitation was being interpreted as weakness. The moment of uncertainty was passing. Whatever recognition had flickered in those burning eyes was fading, replaced once again by predatory hunger. But still she couldn't speak. The words sat like stones in her throat, too heavy with consequence to release. If she used the shadow speech now, if she revealed what she truly was, there would be no more hiding. No more anonymous nights in abandoned buildings, no more slipping through London's crowds like a ghost. The supernatural world would know she existed, would know that somewhere in the slums of the East End, a shadow weaver still drew breath. Her mother had died to keep that secret, had let them drag her into the street and put a blade through her heart rather than use her power to fight back, had chosen death over discovery. We are the last, Mira. When I'm gone, you'll be alone with this burden. If they find you, if they know what you are, they'll use you until there's nothing left, or destroy you to prevent that fate. There is no middle path for our kind. The hellhound's weight shifted, and she knew with crystalline certainty that it was about to spring. Her paralysis wouldn't matter in another heartbeat. The choice would be made for her, permanently and finally. She would die here, in this forgotten room, with her secrets intact and her mother's sacrifice honored. But as the beast's muscles bunched for its leap, a new terror seized her. Not the fear of speaking the forbidden words, but the fear of silence itself, of giving up, of letting 3 years of desperate survival end in surrender. She thought of Mary Kelly, lying butchered 2 streets from where Mira had once begged for scraps, of the children in the workhouse who had simply stopped fighting one day, their eyes going dull as they waited for death to claim them, of every moment she had chosen to keep breathing, keep moving, keep struggling against a world that wanted nothing more than to grind her into dust. Was this how it ended? Not with the Ripper's blade or a constable's club or slow starvation, but with noble silence in a cursed manner. The shadow words pressed harder against her lips, and she could taste their power. Dark honey and copper pennies, smoke and starlight. They whispered of possibilities beyond mere survival, of strength that could turn predator into prey, of magic that could reshape the very shadows around her. But they also whispered of consequence, of the price that power always demanded. The hellhound's eyes flared brighter, and foam dripped from its terrible fangs. Whatever moment of recognition had stayed its attack was dissolving like morning mist. In seconds those jaws would close around her throat, and all her fears about speaking would become irrelevant. Choose, the darkness seemed to whisper. Choose quickly. Death with dignity, taking her secrets to an unmarked grave, or life with all its terrible complications, pursued, hunted, used as a weapon by forces she couldn't comprehend. Her mother had chosen dignity, had chosen sacrifice. But her mother had also chosen to give birth to a daughter, had chosen to teach her the letters and numbers that became tools of survival, had chosen to call her little shadow with love rather than fear. Maybe, Mira thought, as the hellhound's muscles reached their breaking point, maybe the choice itself was the answer her mother had tried to give her. Not silence or speech, but the right to decide for herself what her life, however brief, might mean. The beast leaped, and Mira Blackwood opened her mouth, still uncertain which words would emerge. The word that escaped her lips was neither English nor silence, but something that existed in the space between, a single syllable that tasted of midnight and memory. Veleth, brother. The shadow's speech poured from her throat like liquid starlight, and the hellhound froze mid-leap, as if struck by invisible chains. Its massive form hung suspended in the air for one impossible heartbeat before crashing to the floor with enough force to shake dust from the rafters, but it made no move to attack. Instead, those burning eyes widened with something that looked disturbingly like recognition. Mira felt the word's resonance ripple outward through the manor, sinking into stone and timber like water into thirsty earth. The shadows in the corners of the room writhed and deepened, responding to the first shadow speech these walls had heard in centuries. Ancient wards that had slumbered in the very foundation began to wake, their magic recognizing the bloodline they were bound to protect. There's no taking it back now. The thought should have terrified her, but instead, Mira felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years: power. Not the desperate scrambling for survival that had defined her existence, but true agency. The shadows no longer felt like enemies pressing in from all sides. They felt like an extension of herself, dark fingers she could flex and bend to her will. The hellhound remained motionless, its great head tilted in an almost canine expression of confusion. She could see its nostrils flaring as it processed her scent, and something in its posture had shifted from predatory to protective. The growl in its chest had become a low whine, as if it were struggling against conflicting instincts. "I know what you are," she whispered, and more shadow words spilled from her lips without conscious thought. "Keth Mor Veleth, Keth Mor Thane, you are my brother, you are my guardian." The beast's massive frame shuddered, and when it looked at her again, the hunger in its eyes had been replaced by something far more unsettling: devotion. It lowered its great head in what could only be described as a bow, and Mira realized with growing alarm that her desperate gamble had worked too well. She had crossed a threshold, and the magical foundations of Whitmore Manor were responding in ways she couldn't have anticipated. The air itself felt different now, charged with possibility and crackling with awakening power. Somewhere in the depths of the house, she could hear the sound of stone grinding against stone, as if ancient mechanisms long dormant were beginning to turn. The hellhound rose to its feet with fluid grace, no longer the monster that had stalked her through the manor's halls. When it padded closer, she didn't retreat. Something in the shadow speech had changed the fundamental nature of their relationship, binding them in ways that bypassed rational thought. It was no longer her predator. It was her guardian. The realization should have been comforting, but instead it filled her with a new kind of terror. Because if the hellhound was her guardian, that meant she was something that needed guarding. Something important enough to warrant a creature of shadow and flame as protection. Something valuable enough to imprison. "What have I done?" she breathed, but the words emerged in the shadow tongue, "Ketulvoren." The beast's ears pricked forward, and it took another step closer. When its massive head dipped toward her, she found herself reaching out instinctively to touch the coarse fur between its eyes. The contact sent a jolt of connection through her, not painful, but overwhelming. For a moment, she could see through its burning gaze, could feel the weight of centuries pressing down like a stone. Bound, waiting, protecting something precious that was lost long ago, and now it wasn't lost anymore. Mira jerked her hand back, but the connection lingered. She could feel the hellhound's presence at the edge of her consciousness, like a warm ember, waiting for direction she had no idea how to give. The shadow words came easier now, as if speaking them aloud had opened floodgates she'd spent years holding closed. Behind the beast, she caught movement in the doorway. Not another creature, but something far more unsettling. The shadows themselves were taking shape, coalescing into forms that suggested rather than revealed. Watchers drawn by the sound of their lost language, guardians awakening from centuries of slumber. The manor was coming alive around her, and Mira understood with crystalline clarity that she could never return to her old life. The homeless girl who had crept through these doors seeking shelter was gone, dissolved the moment that first shadow word had left her lips. Whatever she was becoming, whatever she had always been beneath layers of denial and fear, it was stirring to wakefulness, like a dragon uncurling from its hoard. The threshold had been crossed. The words had been spoken. The bloodline had been revealed. There was no path but forward now, into darkness deeper and stranger than any London fog. The shadows in the doorway rippled like water disturbed by an unseen hand, and Mira's breath caught as three figures emerged from the darkness. Not creatures of flesh and bone like the hellhound, but something far older, wraiths of smoke and starlight that moved with purpose born of centuries. Her newfound guardian positioned itself between her and the approaching shadows, a low rumble building in its chest. But these weren't enemies. Even as her heart hammered against her ribs, Mira could feel their intent washing over her in waves of ancient recognition. They were drawn by the shadow speech, yes, but not as hunters, as servants. The first wraith spoke, its voice like wind through autumn leaves. Thanel Morket. Soleth Varentul. The lady has returned. We have waited long. Lady? The word escaped her in English before she could stop it, and the shadows recoiled as if burned. She felt their disappointment like a physical weight. They expected fluency in their lost tongue, mastery of powers she could barely comprehend. I don't understand. But even as she spoke, the shadow words came unbidden. Vorentul het soleth. What is it you have waited for? The second wraith drifted closer, its form more solid than the others. Features began to emerge from the darkness, high cheekbones, eyes like chips of obsidian, the suggestion of armor that had turned to mist. Morketh Thanel Ashworth. Morketh, binding Vel Thulsaren. You are the Ashworth heir. You are the binding that was broken. Ashworth. The name struck her like a physical blow, dredging up memories of her mother's terrified whispers. The vampire lords who ruled from shadow, the ancient bloodlines that had carved up London's supernatural territories like feudal kingdoms. And somewhere at the heart of it all, a name spoken only in fearful reverence. Lucian Ashworth, the vampire king who had vanished decades ago, leaving his domain in chaos. "That's impossible," she whispered, but her voice shook with growing uncertainty. "My mother was a seamstress. We lived in Whitechapel. I'm nobody." The third wraith laughed, a sound like glass breaking in moonlight. "Thainel Morhet. Shadow blood runs true, even when denied, even when hidden in the gutters of the mortal world." The hellhound pressed closer to her side, its warmth an anchor against the supernatural storm building around her. Through their connection she could feel its memories stirring, fragments of another time when shadow speech had echoed through these halls. A young woman with dark hair and defiant eyes, speaking the old words with power that made the very stones tremble. Not Mira, but someone who shared her features. Someone who had fled this place pregnant and desperate, carrying secrets that would die with her in a Whitechapel tenement. Her grandmother, the shadow weaver who had loved a vampire king and paid the price for that forbidden union. Test her. The first wraith's command cut through her reeling thoughts. The bloodline may run true, but power must be proven. The manor's defenses require a true heir, not merely shadow-touched. Before Mira could ask what that meant, the temperature in the room plummeted. Frost began forming on the windows, and her breath came in sharp puffs that hung in the air like accusations. The shadows along the walls deepened until they seemed to extend into infinite darkness, and from those depths came sounds that made her soul shiver. The scrape of claws on stone, the whisper of wings, the distant howl of things that should not exist. "Speak the words of binding," the second wraith commanded. "Command the guardians to stillness, or be consumed by that which you cannot control." The hellhound's muscles tensed beneath its fur, and she realized with growing horror that it was struggling against something. Its burning eyes flickered between devotion and hunger, as if the manor's awakening power was testing the bonds her shadow speech had forged. Other presences pressed against the edges of her consciousness, creatures stirring in the deep places of Whitmore Manor, ancient guardians whose loyalty had to be earned rather than assumed. "Keth Morthul Saren," she began, the words coming from some instinct deeper than thought. "Veleth Mor Shandar. Soluthan Mor Cathal. You are bound to me, brothers of shadow. Rest until I call." The shadow words rippled outward with visible force, and she felt the manor's response like a living thing. Some of the pressing darkness retreated, accepting her command, but other presences resisted, testing her will against theirs. The hellhound steadied, its loyalty reinforced, but from the corridors beyond came the sound of things that remained unconvinced. The wraiths watched her with expressions that might have been approval. Better, the first acknowledged, but incomplete. The deep guardians require proof of worthiness, not merely blood. You must learn the old ways, young shadow. Learn them quickly, or the manor's protections will consume you along with any who dare trespass here. As if summoned by their words, footsteps echoed from the main hall, measured, deliberate, and decidedly human. Someone was approaching through the awakening darkness, drawn by the resonance of shadow speech and the stirring of powers that had slumbered too long. The test was about to begin in earnest. The footsteps grew louder, each measured tread echoing through the manor like a countdown to judgment. Mira's hand found purchase in Fenris's coarse fur, drawing strength from the hellhound's steady presence as the wraiths began to fade back into the shadows they had emerged from. "Prepare yourself, young heir," the first wraith whispered, its form already becoming translucent. Not all who serve the old bloodline do so willingly. Some must be reminded of their place. The creatures melted away, just as the great doors to the hall swung open with a groan of ancient hinges. The man who entered moved with predatory grace despite his apparent humanity, tall and lean, dressed in the fine clothes of a gentleman, but carrying himself like a soldier. His pale eyes swept the room, taking in the scattered furniture, the frost still clinging to the windows, and finally settling on Mira with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Well," he said, his cultured accent carrying undertones of something far older than Victorian propriety. "It seems the rumors of disturbance were not exaggerated." Fenris stepped forward, placing himself more firmly between Mira and the newcomer. The hellhound's lips pulled back to reveal fangs like obsidian daggers, but the man showed no fear. Instead, he studied the beast with clinical interest. "Fascinating. The Guardian awakens after all these years. Which means—" His gaze shifted back to Mira, and she saw recognition flicker in those pale depths. "You must be the source of tonight's rather dramatic, magical resonance. Tell me, child, do you have any idea what you've unleashed?" "I don't know what you're talking about." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, made worse by the shadow words that wanted to spill out instead. She could feel the manor's power thrumming through the floorboards, responding to her emotional state. The darkness in the corners seemed to pulse with her heartbeat. The man smiled, and there was nothing warm in the expression. "No? Then perhaps you can explain why every supernatural creature within a mile of this place is currently clawing at my mental barriers, desperate to investigate the shadow speech that shattered their evening's peace." Shadow speech. He knew what she was, what she'd done. The careful walls of denial she'd built crumbled a little further. "You felt it too," she said, abandoning pretense. "That's why you're here." "Indeed." He began to circle them slowly, keeping his distance from Fenris but studying Mira with predatory interest. "Though I confess surprise at finding the source to be a half-starved waif from the East End, rather than some properly trained heir finally claiming their birthright." Each word was a calculated strike, designed to make her feel small and unprepared. And it was working. The confidence she'd gained from commanding the wraiths began to ebb, replaced by the familiar shame of being judged and found wanting. She was still just a street rat playing at powers beyond her understanding. But Fenris pressed closer to her side, and through their bond she felt something unexpected, the hellhound's absolute certainty that she belonged here, not because of noble bearing or magical training, but because her blood sang with the same power that had bound him centuries ago. Because when she spoke the shadow tongue, the very stones of Whitmore Manor recognized their mistress returned. "Who are you?" she demanded, finding her voice again. "Sebastian Cross, steward of this estate in the absence of its rightful master." He paused in his circling to fix her with that unnerving stare. "A master who has been indisposed for quite some time, which raises the rather pressing question of what to do with you." The temperature dropped another degree, and Mira realized the chill wasn't coming from the manor's awakening magic. It was radiating from Cross himself. Whatever he wasn't entirely human. "The wraiths called me heir," she said, surprising herself with her boldness. "If that's true, then this is my home now." Cross laughed, a sound like ice cracking over deep water. "Heir, yes, but inheritance requires more than blood, child. It requires strength, understanding, the will to claim what is yours and hold it against all who would take it from you." As he spoke, she became aware of other presences gathering beyond the manor's walls, shadows that moved wrong in the gaslight, shapes that watched from impossible angles. The supernatural population of London was indeed responding to her display of power, drawn by curiosity, hunger, or darker purposes. "They're coming," Cross continued, seemingly unbothered by the building's supernatural pressure. "Drawn by your little performance tonight. Vampires who remember the Ashworth name, demons who hunger for shadow-touched blood, things far worse than either." Fear clawed at her throat, but beneath it, something else stirred. Anger. She had spent 3 years running, hiding, swallowing her power to avoid exactly this scenario. But the running was over now. The hiding had ended the moment she spoke that first shadow word. "Then teach me," she said, the words emerging steady despite her thundering heart. "You said inheritance requires understanding. Help me understand." Cross studied her for a long moment, pale eyes weighing possibilities she couldn't fathom. Outside, something howled in the distance, a sound that made Fenris's ears flatten against his skull. Very well, Cross said finally. But understand this, young heir, the lessons begin now, and failure means death, for both of us. The air in the hall grew thick with anticipation, pressing against Mira's lungs like a living thing. Cross moved to the center of the room, his pale eyes reflecting light that shouldn't exist in the shadows, and began to speak words that made the darkness writhe. Morthul ket Sarenvel, Ashworth Thane Morket Thul. The shadow tongue poured from his lips with practiced ease, and Mira felt the mana respond with violent enthusiasm. The walls themselves seemed to pulse, ancient sigils blazing to life along the cornices and door frames, runes that hurt to look at directly, symbols that predated human civilization by millennia. The first lesson, Cross said, switching back to English with jarring abruptness, is that heritage without power is merely pretty blood waiting to be spilled. Your bloodline makes you valuable, child, but it also makes you a target for every creature that remembers what the Ashworth line was capable of. As if summoned by his words, something scratched at the manor's front doors, not the polite knock of a visitor, but the desperate clawing of predators sensing wounded prey. Fenris's hackles rose, his massive form trembling with barely restrained violence, but Cross held up a hand. Let them come. She needs to see what she's truly facing. The scratching intensified, joined by other sounds, the scrape of bone against stone, whispers in languages that predated human speech, the wet slide of things that should not exist pressing against windows and walls. The supernatural denizens of London had indeed come calling, drawn by the resonance of awakened shadow magic like moths to a flame. Mira's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to stand straighter. What do they want? Some seek to serve, Cross replied, his attention fixed on the main doors as something heavy struck them from outside. Others hunger for the taste of shadow-touched blood. Most simply wish to test whether the new Ashworth heir is worthy of the name, or merely another pretender to be eliminated. The doors bulged inward with the force of whatever was attempting entry. Ancient oak groaned and splintered, but held, protected by wards that blazed brighter with each assault. Still, Mira could see the magical defenses wavering like candle flames in a hurricane. How do I prove worthiness to creatures I've never seen before? Cross turned to face her, and in his pale eyes she saw something that might have been approval, or perhaps just hunger for violence about to be unleashed. By showing them that you command powers they dare not challenge, by speaking words that will bind them to your will, or send them fleeing into the night. By becoming what you were born to be, rather than what 3 years of gutters and fear have made you. The shadow words rose in her throat without conscious summoning, pulled from some deep well of inherited knowledge. But these weren't the gentle commands she'd used with Fenris or the Wraiths. These words tasted of iron and midnight, of authority backed by centuries of supernatural dominion. Kethal Morthul Varan, Ashworth Thane Saran Ketvel Mordan. The power that erupted from her was like nothing she'd experienced before. It crashed outward through the manor's walls with the force of a tidal wave, carrying her will and her bloodline's ancient authority into the supernatural gathering beyond. She felt their shock like a physical blow, creatures that had expected to find easy prey instead discovering something that made their deepest instincts scream warnings. Some fled immediately, their terror broadcasting across the psychic spectrum as they recognized what she was becoming. Others pressed closer, drawn by the promise of power beyond their comprehension. But a few, a precious, dangerous few, dropped to their knees in the muddy courtyard and spoke words of fealty in languages older than civilization. The assault on the doors ceased abruptly. In the sudden silence, Mira could hear her own ragged breathing and the wild rhythm of her heart. The shadow words had torn something fundamental inside her throat, leaving her voice raw and strange. Cross watched her with newfound respect, but also something that might have been concern. Impressive, but shadow speech of that magnitude requires strength you don't yet possess. Look at yourself, child. Mira glanced down and gasped. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably, and dark veins showed through her pale skin like cracks in porcelain. The words had drawn power directly from her life force, and she could feel the deficit like ice in her bones. The second lesson, Cross continued relentlessly, is that every display of power has a price. Use too much too quickly, and you'll burn yourself to ash from the inside out. Your grandmother learned that truth too late. It's what killed her in that Whitechapel tenement, trying to hide her nature from those who hunted her. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Her mother's death hadn't been natural illness, as she'd always believed. It had been the cost of denying what she was, of using shadow magic without proper training or restraint. Fenris pressed against her side, his warmth helping to drive back the ice in her veins, but Cross wasn't finished. The creatures outside aren't gone, merely waiting. And sunrise will bring worse threats, humans who serve darker masters, hunters who specialize in removing supernatural problems from London's streets. His pale eyes glittered with anticipation. Your real education begins now. The weakness from her shadow speech display hadn't faded by dawn. If anything, Mira felt worse. Those dark veins beneath her skin had spread like infection, and every breath came with the taste of copper and ash. Fenris remained pressed against her side, his warmth the only thing keeping the bone-deep chill at bay, but even the hellhound's presence couldn't mask her deteriorating condition. Cross had spent the hours before sunrise preparing defenses, muttering incantations that made the manor's stones hum with protective energy. But when the first pale light crept through the frost-covered windows, his expression grew grim. "They're here," he said simply. Mira struggled to her feet, using Fenris as support. Through the grimy glass, she could see figures emerging from the London fog, men in dark coats moving with military precision, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. But there was something wrong about the way they walked, the way shadows seemed to bend around them despite the growing daylight. "The Crimson Order," Cross explained, his voice tight with old hatred. "Vampire hunters who've forgotten their original purpose. Now they serve whoever pays them best, and their current master has a particular interest in shadow-touched bloodlines." "We can fight them," Mira whispered, though the words rang hollow. She could barely stand, let alone command the manor's supernatural defenses. "With what power?" Cross's laugh was bitter. "You've burned through your reserves, and I'm sworn to protect this estate, not wage war against an army. No, child, this was always going to be the test. Whether you can survive what your awakening has brought down upon us." The hunters spread out around the manor's perimeter with practiced efficiency. Mira counted at least 20 figures, each carrying weapons that gleamed with more than mere steel, silver, and something else, something that made her skin crawl even at this distance. Then she saw him. The man directing the hunters was tall and elegant, wrapped in a coat that seemed to devour the morning light. Even from across the courtyard she could feel the weight of his attention like ice against her soul. When he raised his head to look directly at the window where she stood, his smile revealed teeth that had never been human. "Magistrate Kane," Cross breathed, and for the first time since she'd met him, the steward sounded genuinely afraid. "This is worse than I thought. He's not just a hunter, he's one of the ancient ones. A vampire so old he's forgotten his own origins." The realization crashed over Mira like freezing water. The creatures she'd driven away last night, they hadn't fled in fear. They'd gone to report her presence to something far more dangerous. Her display of power hadn't protected her, it had signed her death warrant. Kane raised one pale hand, and his hunters began their advance on the manor. But these weren't the desperate clawing attacks of last night's supernatural mob. This was coordinated, methodical, the approach of predators who knew exactly how to breach ancient defenses. "The wards," Mira gasped, watching silver light begin to eat away at the protective barriers Cross had spent hours reinforcing. "They're failing." "Kane's power is older than mine," Cross admitted. "Older than this manor, older than the bloodline that built it. He was hunting shadow-touched families when your ancestors were still learning to speak their first words of power." Fenris whined low in his throat, his massive form trembling, not with fear, but with the effort of maintaining their bond while her strength continued to ebb. Through their connection, she could feel his desperate loyalty warring against the growing certainty that she was dying. The shadow speech had taken too much, burned through reserves she didn't know existed, and now the price was coming due. The manor's front doors exploded inward with a sound like thunder. Cain stepped through the wreckage with casual grace, his ancient features serene as tomb marble. Behind him came his hunters, their silver weapons gleaming with deadly purpose. "Mira Blackwood," Cain said, and her true name on his lips sounded like a judgment being passed. "Granddaughter of Elena the Shadow Weaver, last heir of a bloodline that should have died decades ago. You've caused quite a stir in supernatural circles, child." Cross stepped protectively in front of her, but Cain barely spared him a glance. "Stand aside, steward. Your oath is to protect Ashworth property, not doomed pretenders." "She is Ashworth property," Cross replied, though his voice shook. "By blood and birthright." Cain's laughter was like breaking glass. "Blood, yes, but birthright requires the strength to claim it. Look at her, Cross. She's burning herself to ash from the inside out, just as her grandmother did, just as they all do when they try to wield power beyond their mortal frames." The truth of his words was written in the spreading darkness beneath Mira's skin, in the way her legs could barely support her weight. She had awakened something magnificent and terrible, only to discover that her human heritage made her too weak to contain it. Fenris snarled and lunged at the nearest hunter, but silver nets flew through the air, wrapping around the hellhound with bonds that blazed with holy light. The great beast crashed to the floor, writhing in agony as the blessed silver burned through his supernatural hide. "No!" Mira's scream tore from her ruined throat, but she had no power left to command, no strength left to fight. She could only watch as Cain approached with ancient patience, his smile promising an end to pain that felt almost merciful. Her awakening had brought nothing but destruction. The manor would fall, Fenris would die in silver chains, and the last ember of the Ashworth line would be extinguished by her own weakness. The darkness rising behind her eyes felt like coming home.